All right. Well,
No,
again, everybody, thanks for being here. Good evening. So today we're going to talk about plant pollinators, which is very exciting to me because it involves insects. So most plant pollinators are actually insects, but I'll get into that momentarily. So to begin, what exactly is pollination? So this word gets thrown out a lot, right? Pollinators, pollination. But so it's really good to bring it back and just describe what it is. So pollination is the act of transferring pollen grains from the male part of the flower to the female part of the flower. So it's the first step in this process of producing seeds, fruits, and ultimately creating offspring from the next generation for the plant. And there's a variety of ways in which this can occur. It occurs through self-pollination, which isn't as common as abiotic and biotic vector type pollination. So that would be wind and water pollination, or through the work of animals. So as I mentioned, very few plants self-pollinate without the aid of pollen vectors. And over 70% of plant species rely on animals. So animals such as insects, birds, bats, hummingbirds, etc., for pollination. So wind pollination, to describe wind pollination, this is, would y'all please mute yourselves? I'm getting a lot of feedback, so if you would just please mute yourself. So anyway, yeah, wind pollination basically is pollen that is being transported by the wind. So a lot of these plants that are wind pollinated, looking at them, it's kind of interesting. They kind of have like these characteristics where they don't have big showy flowers, and what they do is they produce a lot of pollen grains. So you can see here in this image of wind-blown pollen from the male cone of a lodgepole pine. So they basically are spewing out a lot of pollen. Wind helps them pollinate. Some important crops that are wind pollinated are wheat, rice, corn, rye, barley, and oats. And there are many trees that are wind pollinated. So I have some examples of native wind pollinated plants here. So things like sagebrush, blue grama, pinyon pine, cottonwood, juniper, winterfat. A lot of these types of plants are wind pollinated. And if you look at them, they tend to have feathery kind of like structures. A lot of grasses tend to be wind pollinated, a lot of conifers. So here are some examples of that. So to get into the meat of the talk, biotic pollination, also known as pollen vectoring or pollen vectors, animal pollination. This is basically pollination that involves organisms, so organisms that are animals, to move pollen from one flower to another. And 80% of flowering plants, or angiosperms, which they're called, rely on pollen vectors. So that's a lot of plants, 80% of flowering plants. And over 70% of plant species rely on animals. So animals such as insect, birds, as I mentioned earlier, for pollination. And a lot of these are insects. So just to kind of give you an idea here, this is a figure of a honeybee cross-pollinated flower. So they, on their little legs, they collect pollen grains and they move it over to another flower. So they're assisting with that pollination process. And it's really cool, actually. There's a lot of research that shows that a lot of flowers have these relationships with bees, and bees can see different light than we can. They can see ultraviolet and ultraviolet light. So this image on the far right shows you a flower under normal light and then under ultraviolet light. So that image on the right that looks kind of like pinkish and white, that's how a bee sees the flower. So a lot of flowers actually have these nectar guides that go, hey, come here, pollinate me. So it's pretty cool, like the relationship that insects have with flowers. So who are the pollinators? I keep talking a little bit about, the different animals, these different pollen vectors. So these animals that are moving over pollen are pollinators. So birds, bats, small mammals, and insects. And the insects, there's a lot of different types of insects that are pollinators beyond just bees. So things like ants, beetles, butterflies, flies, moths, wasps. There are thousands of species of pollinators worldwide. So about, if we're going to be conservative, you could say around 100,000 species of different animals or pollinators. And most of these are insects. About 1,500 of them are birds, bats, mammals. I think there's some even funky examples of large mammals, but I'm an entomologist, so I don't know as much about the weird examples of plants that are pollinated by large mammals. But yeah, a lot of these are insects, but I have here some images that show you different pollinators. So we got a bat here pollinating a cactus flower, and then an image of milkweed with a monarch butterfly and a hummingbird. So what these pollinators are getting out of this relationship of, pollinating the plants is they get nectar and or pollen to eat. So when they're doing this, when they're in there collecting pollen, they're moving it around and they're transferring it from plant to plant. And there are different types of these pollinators. We have generalist pollinators and specialist pollinators. So generalist pollinators are animals that visit several different types of plant species. This is something like the honeybee and a lot of bees. Now, there are some bees that are specialist pollinators. And what a specialist pollinator is basically means that this insect has a relationship with one or a few plant species. They're very specialized. It's very specific. And as I mentioned, this presentation really focuses a lot on insect pollinators. So I'll go into the different groups of that and then provide some examples from New Mexico of different plants that are pollinated by insects. So if you guys want to throw in the chat here guesses as to what percentage of fruits and vegetables are grown in the United States that are pollinated by honeybees, wild native bees, and other insects, out of 100, if you want to throw it in the chat, I'll give you like a couple of seconds to do that if you want. Nice. I like the optimism, 95%. That's really cool. It's actually about 75%. Now there are some research that show between 70 to 80%, but if we want to be kind of conservative, around 70 to 75%. So a lot of things are pollinated by insects. And New Mexico has a lot of native pollinators. Here's just some examples of things that I've seen when I've gone out on hikes or done field work, like butterflies, flies, beetles, bees, wasps, all kinds of critters. So the first group that I'll talk about are bees. So bees are in the insect order Hymenoptera, and New Mexico has over 1,000 species of native bees. That's a lot of bees. So as I mentioned, there are all these native bees beyond just the honeybee. So we have things like longhorn bees, sweat bees, miner bees, and I'll get into each of those here now. But just thinking about the diversity of bees, there are thousands of species of different types of bees. In this image here, you can see this carpenter bee, which is pretty large. This is like a United States quarter. They can be quite sizable. And then there's this teeny tiny sweat bee. So you can just kind of see like how diverse that they are just from this one image, that, their sizes vary, which is pretty interesting if you think about it, because flowers also vary in their size. So the first group that I'll talk about are halictids, the sweat bees. So these guys are, there's a lot of species of them. In the United States, we have about 500 species. These guys, or gals really, it's the ladies doing most of the work, but these bees are important pollinators of crops and wildflowers. So things like sunflowers, stone fruits, apples, and alfalfa. And these gals don't have huge colonies like honeybees. What they do is they nest in the ground or in rotting wood with like tiny little small families. And their characteristics, they're typically pretty distinctive. They are, I guess I have, sorry, I need to go back, but I don't know why I guess I have a timer on, sorry. Anyway, so these guys tend to be metallic and shiny. Some of them are red, some of them are green, but that's usually pretty distinctive of sweat bees. And there's some other esoteric kind of stuff entomologists use to key them out down to species. So they have like different groups of bees have different wing venation, and I'll have some examples of that on some of these other slides. So I'm sorry, am I still on Zoom?
Yeah, you're still on Zoom. We don't though.
Okay, yeah, everything just froze, so I'm sorry about that. Let me share my screen again. Technical difficulties.
Right. Okay, you're good.
Okay. Yay. All right. Sorry about that. Yeah, it just like froze on me, and I was like, oh. Okay, so let's move on to the next family of bees, the Andrenids, the minor bees. So I think these bees are pretty cute. They have like these little fuzzy faces, and there are lots of different species of these. So I'm not sure how many necessarily are in North America, but worldwide there are over 3,000 species of them. And they nest in the ground, mainly in sandy soil, so a lot of like sandy areas. This family of bees includes some of the earliest species to emerge in the spring. So they're like early time spring pollinators, and they vary in their size. They can be kind of medium to small. And what's characteristic of them is they have like this velvety patch of hair near their eyes. So they have those little small little hairs that are in the fronts of their face. So the next group, the Apidae, this is the largest family of bees. It's highly diverse with many species. So worldwide, over 20,000 species, about 4,000 in the US. These are very important pollinators, and not just the honeybee. There are lots of native apids that are super important, like squash bees and bumblebees. So lots of diversity in this. And as I mentioned, wing venation is an important characteristic that we use as entomologists to key them down to species. So the next one, colelids, these are yellow-faced bees or passer bees. These are small, teeny bees. Again, another large family of bees. Their eyes tend to slant slightly towards the mouth, and some have hair. Some are hairless, or little hair rather, not hairless, but little hair. So they can kind of vary in what they look like. And there's a cool species in New Mexico that buzz pollinates, which means it gets into the flowers of a particular plant, and it'll buzz and it helps like move the pollen around. And that's like an interesting way to pollinate. So kind of neat bees. Next, the leafcutter bees, megachilids. There are over 4,000 species of these worldwide, a little over 600 species in North America that are described. These gals nest in holes of dead wood or hollow twigs. What they do that's pretty interesting is they collect little bits of leaf matter to help build their nests. And if you ever see something like this, it looks almost like a cartoon, like a little round part taken out of the leaf. It doesn't really harm the plant. Research has shown that it's very minimal damage. So it just helps them build their nests. And what's unique about them is they have very hairy undersides of their abdomen. So that's how they collect pollen versus on their legs like a honeybee would. So that's what the leafcutter bee does when they collect pollen, get it on their abdomen. Next group, wasps. So wasps, there's a lot of generalist pollinators of wasps. So lots of different families of them, like vespids, things like paper wasps, yellow jackets, potter wasps. A lot of potter wasps are good pollinators in the Southwest. Thread-waisted wasps, and then my personal favorite, scaliid wasps. These are very hairy wasps. They're also parasitoids of scarab beetles, of the larvae of some pesky beetles. So they're pretty neat, and I think they're really cool, like how big and colorful and hairy they are. But it's a personal favorite pollinator. Next, butterflies and moths. So Lepidoptera. There's a whole variety of moths and butterflies that are pollinators. Some are generalists, some are specialists. So there are some sphingids, these hawk moths or sphinx moths. Some of them tend to be specialists, and yucca actually is moth pollinated, which I'll get into when I go over some more examples. But lots of diversity in Lepidoptera that are pollinators, and they tend to be very showy, or a lot of these large butterflies tend to be pollinators of larger flowers. Flies, believe it or not, but flies are pollinators. So there are a lot of flies, thousands and thousands of species. What makes a fly? They have one pair of wings or two wings, and then they have these little, their hind wings are these modified things called halteres, which help them stabilize their bodies in flight. So one of the reasons why it's hard to swat a fly is because of those. So you can thank the halteres. But we don't want to swat these ones, the good flies. Hoverflies are these flies that look like bees or wasps. They're mimics of them, and there is a lot of diversity in them, and lots of different relationships, which we're still learning about. What syrphids, hoverflies, what they're pollinating. So, but there's a lot of them, and they're really neat. And if you ever look and you think you see a wasp, look twice, because you might be actually seeing a hoverfly. So next, I'll get into some examples of plants pollinated by insects in New Mexico. So alfalfa is bee pollinated. There are a variety of native bees that pollinate alfalfa, but one that's a lot of research has been done that shows that they're very effective pollinators for alfalfa is the alfalfa leaf cutting bee. So this is a megachilid. There's an image of one right here on the bottom right. The large numbers of these have been used to pollinate an alfalfa seed crop, and it's been shown that alfalfa seed yields greatly increase compared to pollination with honeybees or no bees. So sometimes honeybees actually aren't the most efficient pollinator, and some of our native pollinators are better at doing the job. And if you think about it, each flower and each insect has its own kind of life history, and they might have a different relationship, but generalist pollinators still can be effective, but sometimes it's good to have something that's more specialized. Prickly pear is insect pollinated, so things like bees and beetles. If you've ever observed these beautiful yellow flowers and seen these little chunky looking bugs in there, chances are they're probably a scarab beetle. There's a couple of different species of scarab beetles that pollinate prickly pear cactus flowers. Also a variety of native bees. These flowers are very sweet, and a lot of generalist pollinators really like to visit them. Lots of different types of bees, medium-sized to large bees, can be found on Opuntia species that are larger. And then when they're smaller species of this cactus, smaller bees can be found pollinating the flowers, and even smaller types of beetles. So it's pretty neat that you can find a variety of bugs in these flowers. Next, squash. So squash is bee pollinated. And commercially, honeybees are used, but they're probably not the most effective pollinator. We actually have some native squash bees that are really, they have like this really neat relationship with squash. So there's some photos of them here. I think they're pretty cute, cute bees, but they're really good for squash pollinating, and a variety of species of squash with a variety of species of squash bees. So. Oh yeah, Xenoglossa. I really like Xenoglossa bees. They're really neat. Yucca, as I mentioned, yucca plants are pollinated by moths. So yes, they are moth pollinated. And each species of yucca has its own corresponding species of yucca moth. So there are two different genera of these moths, these yucca moths, and yucca absolutely needs them. It can't be wind pollinated, and other pollinators aren't as effective as like this yucca moth. So it's a very intricate relationship where the moth can really get inside those flowers and spread around the pollen. So pretty neat. And living here, like I've had a chance to see a variety of different types of yucca here in Las Cruces and throughout New Mexico. And I've seen some of these moths, and I think they're really neat. But I didn't have my camera with me, so I don't have my own photos yet, but I hope to get some soon because I think they're really cool. And it's like a really good example of showing that sometimes bees aren't the only pollinators. You have moths, and this moth is a specialist. Watermelon is pollinated by a variety of bees. So bumblebees, longhorn bees, honeybees, sweat bees. Here's an image of a two-spotted longhorn bee pollinating watermelon flower. And then, yeah, honeybees also really like the flowers of watermelon. So lots of bees tend to visit watermelon flowers and pollinate them. And yes, watermelon doesn't always need pollinators, but cross-pollination can help, like, produce more and that sort of thing. So, all right, Utah serviceberry. So this is pollinated by bees, butterflies, and other insects. And it's been really interesting learning more about these plants in the Southwest. I'm originally from the Southeast, so it's really cool to see a lot of the different insect pollinators that visit these plants, and also learn a bit about the plants and why they're important. So we always talk about, by we, I guess, researchers, academics, teachers, master gardeners, we always talk about how important pollinators are, but there's lots of layers to this, right? So we have the plants, we have the pollinators, and then we have the things that the plants do as well. So I like to kind of throw that in sometimes too. So this Utah serviceberry, it has edible berries, which provides food for wildlife and shelter for wildlife, and it's a beautiful plant. And yeah, the swallowtail butterfly is just gorgeous. Like, I love them. They're stunning. Wild rose. This is an awesome plant. It's pollinated by a variety of insects. So bees, wasps, flies, beetles. And here I have a photo of a bumblebee and then a longhorn beetle. So a variety of things love to visit these flowers. And then the other layers to this, the berries are used as food by many animals like birds, beavers, porcupines, small mammals. The plants are used, they're browsed by livestock and big game. And they actually have some human uses too, which was new to me to learn, but I thought that was pretty interesting. So all of the shoots and the petals are used for many human purposes. So pretty neat. And some of these other plants that I'll talk about also have uses as well. So wax currant, this is pollinated by many types of different insects like bees. Here's an image of a native bee pollinating. They provide cover and food for wildlife. The fruit of wax currant is also used for making jam, jelly, pie, and some other tasty treats. Snowberry, this is pollinated by butterflies, bees, moths, wasps, songbirds, and hummingbirds. So here is an image of a clearwing moth, the snowberry clearwing moth. They're quite large. Sometimes if you think you see a hummingbird, it might actually be a moth. So which is cool if you think about it, because they both are similar in the way that they pollinate plants. So these plants are important because they provide food for wildlife, they're useful, and also revegetation of disturbed sites. And they have a variety of human uses. So a lot of it's used medicinally. Red plum, also known as, I knew it as American plum. So this plant is interesting because it can self-pollinated, but it's an example of having cross-pollination from other varieties, helping improve its fruit quality and size and just the health of the plant. So a lot of times I talk about pollination actually being an important component of integrated pest management. So these cultural methods of boosting the health of the ecosystem. But yeah, this American plum, it can be pollinated by flies and bees and beetles. So here's an image of one of those hoverflies I was talking about pollinating American plum. So pretty neat. And there's just so many different bugs and so many different plants. Like this is so much fun to me. Like I love seeing all the different insects that will visit all these different types of plants, like round leaf buffaloberry. I've had the pleasure of looking at a variety of insects on this, and they're flies. So buffaloberry is primarily pollinated by flies. So lots of different species of flies in two different families, Syrphidae and Empiidae. So up to 97% pollinated by flies. There are some wasps and bees that are known to pollinate buffalo berry, and even some true bugs, but it's primarily pollinated by these flies. So here's just 3 different species of flies visiting flowers of the buffalo berry, and the flowers are pretty small, the flies are small, so they're effective pollinators. Next, we have coyote willow. So this is pollinated by bees and other insects. Tends to be smaller bees, smaller insects. And this plant is useful because it helps stabilize stream banks and protect against erosion. Next, we have rabbit brush. So lots of beautiful bees like to visit rabbit brush and are pollinators of this plant. There are lots of species of butterflies that are pollinators of it. And it's a very important plant in our New Mexico landscape. So this plant is an important browse plant for pronghorn, mule deer, jackrabbits, especially in the wintertime. It provides cover for a lot of different animals. It's useful in soil stabilization and restoration. And it also has some human uses like yellow dye and that sort of thing. But here are 3 different species of native bees, like this longhorn bee and the cellophane bee. And then I have some examples of the butterflies. As I mentioned, there's over 20 species of butterflies that have been documented visiting the flowers of the rabbit brush, and they're just beautiful. And a lot of these tend to be generalist, but I'm sure there probably are ones that tend to prefer it in its few narrow host preference for visiting. Next, Oregon grape. This plant is pollinated by bees, moths, butterflies, and hummingbirds. So just because maybe you've noticed, I talk a lot about the insects, but there are other animals that do pollinate. But as I mentioned, a lot of them are insects, but this is one where you get a lot of these larger insects and you get hummingbirds. So as pictured here with this swallowtail butterfly. So this plant provides food for animals and has human uses as well. The berries are edible. Algarita, this is pollinated by butterflies and bees. It has edible berries. It's good for wildlife, a variety of wildlife. And but be careful, as you can see, it's very sharp. But here's an image of a juniper hair streak visiting the flowers on it. So this is also a native that has a variety of butterflies and bees that pollinate it. Antelope bitter brush. This plant is insect pollinated. Actually, all of these are, but a lot of these are. As you can see here, here's a hair streak visiting. These are important native browse shrub for big game and livestock, and they provide shelter for small animals and birds. Buckwheat is pollinated by insects like honeybees, bees, beetles, and there are lots of these plants in a lot of species of these plants in New Mexico. I think what I've seen is 28 species of this plant, and it has a lot of important uses, and it's really good for the landscape. It's a important plant for shelter and forage for animals, and has human uses as well. Here are some examples of insects that pollinate it. So honeybees, lady beetles will even visit. They're not as important as some of these bees and butterflies, but a lot of insects like to visit buckwheat. And it would be interesting to see more research on all the different species of these and what particular insects visit as well, because there are a lot of them, and they are a quite important part of the New Mexico landscape. Ocotillo. So ocotillo is hummingbird pollinated, and a lot of times when you look up, if you look this up, it'll say that it is hummingbird pollinated, but large bees also do pollinate it as well, like this California carpenter bee. So a lot of carpenter bees like to visit them and play a role in pollinating them. So what can you do to help your pollinators? I mentioned a lot of different native plants and also crops that are insect pollinated, but what can you do specifically to help them? So the variety of things that can be done, planting more native plants, planting native grasses, providing water sources, especially in hotter months. So you can use little bowls and put pebbles and fill it with water periodically. There's even little houses you can get for a lot of these solitary bees. So a lot of the bees that I mentioned that nest in rotting wood or in twigs and things like that, you can use little bee habitats. So some examples of grasses that can be used, warm season grasses like sand drop seed, cool season grasses like June grass, Indian rice grass. Those are really good grasses to provide shelter for your pollinators and also a variety of other beneficial insects. Thinking about planting a variety of plants that have different blooming seasons. So things that are blooming in the spring, summer, and fall, because these can provide, they provide nectar sources for some of these pollinators that are important agricultural crop pollinators. So boosting that health of the pollinators in your ecosystem. So also there's a lot of trees that are specifically good for pollinators in New Mexico. This website right here lists trees of New Mexico that can be used. So things like New Mexico olive, and any fruit tree. Bees love fruit trees, so just about any fruit tree is useful. And if you're using insecticides, try not to like use other integrated pest management strategies and insecticides as a last resort. But when you're using insecticides, even if you're using organic insecticides, make sure that you're not spraying flowering plants when pollinators are active. So do it when they're not active. And there are pollinator protection strategies used at local, state, and federal level to protect pollinators and their habitats. So if you go on the EPA, there are tools and strategies for pollinator protection if you want to learn more about that. So just some food for thought. More than half of the world's diet of fats and oils come from animal, especially insects that pollinate plants. So palm oil, canola, sunflowers. Around 150 food crops in the United States depend on pollinators, and this includes almost all fruit and grain crops. And in the US, the USDA estimated the pollination services are worth more than $10 billion per year. So if you think about all the oils and all the foods for us and for animals, like that's a lot that really rely on pollinators. So like our future really does depend on pollinators and trying to learn more about them and protect them and to use insecticides wisely. So there are resources that I have for y'all. So selected plants of Navajo rangelands. This is where I got a lot of these native, like there's a whole list of native plants on there. It's a really good resource. There are pollinator resources. So for IPM and pollinator health. And then there's this pocket guide to native bees of New Mexico that NMSU has. A lot of these are handouts and pamphlets. And then planting for pollinators, if you want to learn more about that. And then the Forest Service and USDA has a lot of information as well. So with that, thank you. And I will open it up to discussion and take any questions.
Thanks, Joni. So you do have a question from Ray. What seeds can we plant now for pollinators?
Right, that's a good question. So that here, let me give you that link right now, because there are, and I'm learning this as well, that there are a lot of different timings in which you have to do things and different times of the year. So there are resources for that we have available. That's a really good question, because you'll want to have some stuff ready for pollinators in the spring, in the fall, and in the summer, right? So that's a really good question. And we do have some resources for that.
Okay, thanks, Ray, for the question. I see a hand raised. Sarah, would you mind unmuting yourself?
Yeah, thank you. I'm just wondering, so is it, say you live in the middle of an area that is not necessarily conducive to a variety of pollinators. It's relatively barren, you're in the middle of the city. Is it really a matter of plant them and they will come, or are there steps that should be followed in order to encourage a variety of pollinators? Is it like, how do you encourage that?
Right. That's a really good question. And that's something that I've struggled with too, like living in cities when I do, especially living in Orlando. Like it can be tricky because you don't have as much space. But if you do have flowering plants, they will come. I've planted some natives and I get a variety of critters that visit. But things that can be really useful are providing them things like that water, right? Like that water source. And if you get some of those native bee structures for nesting, like you will get them, they will come. So if you have resources, you'll get a few. Now you might not have like a whole lot, right? You might just have a few individuals, but the bugs will come. So and I know because like sometimes people, it's like with the bad bugs, like they think, right? So for example, tobacco hornworm, if you plant tomato crops or like just like plants and you have a few, like sometimes you'll get them, like they come. So a lot of these insects, they disperse and they find their resources. So if you just have a few plants, they'll come. If you have water, they'll come. Just the other day, I was watering the plant in the backyard and this wasp just came and was trying to drink as I was pouring the pitcher. So if you have resources for the bugs, they'll come. So it's a really good question because it's like, what can I do in a city, right? I don't have a lot of space. I can't plant like dozens and dozens of flowering plants, but you can have a couple, you could have structures for them, you could have water for them, and you can help just some of them, which is good. I think like if we all did it, it would be really awesome.
Thank you. Good answer.
Thanks, Sarah. Kelly, I see your question was next. What kind of plants could hummingbirds pollinate?
That's great. So a lot of larger flowers, especially with these lawn flowers, I think maybe I should put this like ocotillo is hummingbird pollinated. And then they'll go after milkweed. Really, they're so hungry. And I don't know as much about birds, but hummingbirds I know need to drink a lot of nectar, but they do tend to like larger flowers that have more nectar sources. So if I pull this up.
Trumpet vines are great for hummingbirds.
Yeah. Trumpet vine, and also they like snowberry. So I'll put that in the. Sometimes they'll go after my hair, like when it's really bright.
Oh my gosh. That's interesting. Oh my God.
Yeah, I had like those little buns, right? And my hair was like really magenta, and the hummingbird was trying to get into my. So they like colorful, big, showy flowers, but they're like, as I mentioned, I'm not a ornithologist or a bird person, and but I know a little bit about birds. But yeah, they tend to like these bigger flowers, which swallowtails also like as well.
That's interesting. That's very interesting. I know you mentioned a lot of plants that were originated in my area, such as milkweed, which is surprising because in our area in their tribal ranch, we don't see them. Maybe they do go around there when we're not there and they just come back. I don't know. That's me. That I don't see them, but perhaps they are there and they just decide to be there when we're not around. And the greasewood is another one, which is surprising because for me, I don't see a lot of petals on them, but I mean, I'm sure that it's a source of them to pollinate. And the prickly pear, yes, I see that very often. So it's interesting.
A lot of animals like prickly pear flowers.
Right?
Cool.
Yeah.
Like you can, if you spend like 30 minutes at a prickly pear flower, like when they're in full bloom, you'll see a lot of different animals. It's really cool. I do see another question in here, and it's a really good question. Is organic insecticides still harmful to pollinators? So that is a great question. And I guess the short answer, yes. The long answer, it depends, okay? And the reason for this is, so for example, diatomaceous earth is an organic thing that's used a lot, but the way that it works is it desiccates the bug. So it dries them out, and that can affect any bug. So, and some of these tend to be contacts, right? So if you're applying it to the plant, like a lot of these like oils or soaps, it still can be harmful to them. Not as harmful as, broad spectrum insecticides, but being smart about them, and, whichever organic you're using, look a little more into that, right? So that, like, the EPA has pollination protection strategies. So if you want to know about each particular one, there is information about that, and more and more and more is being known, because, we don't want to harm pollinators, and it is a concern about the decrease in them. But I would pick an organic over a broad spectrum insecticide any day, but there still are limitations to them and how safe that they are for pollinators.
Okay, that is it. That's an interesting question. Thank you, Kelly. And I believe one question that Ray was asking is water for pollinators. What are some easy ways?
For water? Was that the question? Oh, well,
Yeah.
I see. Oh, I see it. Sorry, I see it right now. Yes, water for pollinators. So those little ceramic bowls, and putting pebbles, and maybe pouring a little bit of water in there every day. That's like a common way that's used. If there's water, they're going to go out to it. Now, I know that we live in a very dry, arid place, so it's like, you might have to do it more often than you'd like to, but if you pour a little bit of water every day, it can go a long way. And having those little pebbles there, like in those little dishes, helps with evaporation, but also helps them not dry up as quick.
Okay, thanks, Ray. Thanks, everyone, for your questions. If there are no other questions, okay, I see it. Okay, Kelly,
I
I
love
see
this.
your questions. Yeah, no problem. Can mosquitoes contribute to pollination?
So yes, there actually are examples of midges specifically related to mosquitoes that do pollinate. So, like it is interesting, right? Like there's so many different types of bugs that do so many different types of things, and not all mosquitoes are bad, right? So there is an example, I forget what it is. It's like in South America, there's like a midge that it pollinates a specific type of plant, but it's like escaping me off the top of my head, so you'll have to forgive me. But like, there are some that do.
Okay, thanks, Kyle. Yeah, okay. So much good information. Thank you. Thanks, Kelly. All right. Well, if that's all the questions, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. And I did release a survey, so if you would be kind enough to fill out that survey, I would greatly appreciate it. The last question is more of where you're from. This just shows us of where our educational outreach is reaching. And if you're not from the reservation, just put down what county you're from. For those of you that are from the reservation, just insert what chapter you're affiliated with, and that should be good. Okay, so Joni, thank you so much. A lot of great information. I really love your presentations. So they are really great, and I get a lot of information that we should have more presentations about plant pollinators. So thank you for coming out and being on here on our webinar and sharing this great information.
Thank you. And if you guys have any questions about, any of those things, like using organics for a particular type of plant or system, you can always feel free to reach out for particulars that you need. So I don't know what everybody's needs are. So reaching out helps a lot, because it can help me know what information will be useful to you and to include in future presentations. So thank you.
Thank you, Joni. You're more than welcome to stick around. We're just going to be sharing some upcoming events, but yeah, so thank you, everyone. Oh, and thank you for those of you that are liking this presentation. So a lot of great information. Yes, thank you. Okay, so I see some people in the comments, George. Okay, you close it by mistake. That's fine. I can go ahead and share with you that poll and online, well, through my email, so I can do that. Thank you, everyone, for attending this evening's presentation. So just to let you guys know, next week we don't have a webinar. So since COVID has been lifted, we are getting our foot through the door and getting into in-person workshops. So next week we have a record keeping workshop that was brought to our attention. It's going to be based on livestock for those of you that live here in the San Juan County area. It'll be closer to you. So it'll be hosted at the Herfinale Chapter House. And for those of you from McKinley County area, you're more than welcome to join us. It's going to be starting at 10 a.m. It's going to be pertaining to livestock. So we do have some record calendar books that are both livestock related and crop related. And this was developed by Dr. Michael Patrick and some of his professors and researchers that developed this record keeping book over the COVID period of time. So we're going to be sharing that information on August 31st. That's a date the workshop's going to be held at Herfinale Chapter from 10 all the way to noon. So if you're a livestock producer and you want to know how to practice record keeping, feel free to come by and we'll share a lot of great information. And it's going to be a first come, first serve because we're limited on books, but we're still working at it to get more. So if you're interested in wanting to have an in-person workshop, please email us here at nsaproject@nmsu.edu and we'll respond to you and we'll progress from there. But thank you all for coming on here. Just to let you guys know that we are on Facebook, and we also have a conservation planning program that we collaborate with the Dene College Land Grant Office. So if you're in a need to get your conservation plan developed, regardless if it's rangeland or pertaining to farmland, and you live in the eastern or northern Navajo agencies, this is free of charge. We have hired 4 technicians. 2 of them are located in eastern and 2 of them are located in northern. So if you are interested, feel free to email us. Right there is our email, our main priority email. We get a lot of emails. And if you want to do a workshop instead of like a one-on-one, let us know. And we'll direct you to how to get a request done and so forth. And just to let you guys know, this is another platform that we use. A lot of great information are all on this website. So feel free to put nsa.nmsu.edu in that URL bar, and it'll lead you directly to this homepage here. But other than that, thank you all for joining us. We are on Facebook, YouTube. All of our webinars are recorded and are posted on our YouTube channel. And we'll be coming up with our newsletter this end of this month. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to email us. We have our emails on there, Jesse and I, and our NSA project. So thank you all and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. You guys take care too. My name is Mikkel Lantana, and I am the project specialist for the Navajo Sustainable Agriculture Project. In short, we're called the NSA Project. We are funded by the USDA Outreach and Assistance for Native Farmers and Ranchers and Veteran Farmers and Ranchers program. And we're also part of the New Mexico State University Cooperative Extension Service. And we are in collaborative effort with 2 of our main partners, which is Dene College Land Grant Office and COPE. Not sure if some of you know them, but they stand for Community Outreach and Patient Empowerment. So they're outstationed from Gallup, and you guys may have or may not have met with Carol Palmer. She is the Cope food specialist, and she comes on here several times to provide presentations on far as gardening. So she previously did water storage and harvesting food preservation. So she's really great. She's really knowledgeable in gardening aspect of things and horticulture. So if you have not yet, visit her on our YouTube channel and her presentations, feel free. So it's under, oops, oh no. It's under New Mexico State University Cooperative Extension or NSA project. Sorry about that. But moving on, so going through with our goals and objectives is basically we are here to help producers improve their operations, profitability, and sustainability through our educational programs and technical assistance in the following areas that we serve, which is McKinley County, San Juan, and Cibola County. So to kind of expand on the educational aspect side of things, we provide weekly webinars that we host every week and alternate them from livestock to crops. And this can vary from winter, like such as water storage presentations that I just mentioned that Carol has done as previously, and to vaccine and deworming programs that you can develop for your sheep and cattle and so forth. And as far as increasing our producers' knowledge in the use of USDA programs, which most of you may on here know, the NRCS, FSA, rural development and risk management agencies and services of those of other resource providers. And this can include programs on the Navajo reservation, such as the Agriculture Infrastructure Fund. And lastly, but not least, increase our local production and consumption of fresh fruits and vegetables and healthy foods by Navajo families and individuals through our gardening programs. So with that being said, that's just a whole summarize of who we are as a project.